Chapter 11. Working Alone, Success, The Pile Doctor and Lightning, Rod Peddler, Dr. William Smith comes to investigate. The lesson in electricity, motor and sensory, what is fever, Dr. Smith a convert, the success of lady osteopaths, especially excellent in obstetrics, disease of the season, the allegory of Joshua, basic principles, the too much talk man, charter of the American School of Osteopathy. I worked alone with my investigation until about 1892, when such help as my 4 sons could give, treating many kinds of disease, and heard much talk, good and bad, for and against the new method of curing the afflicted. Paying no attention to comments, I did the work, which was all I tried to do or thought of doing. The results were far better than I had ever dreamed or reasoned I could obtain. People came in great numbers to me to be treated, and my practice yielded me quite a little sum of money. I made appointments for a week or longer in small towns, while in Nevada, Missouri, a man asked if his son could go with me and catch on, as he termed it. I told him it would cost him $100 to get me to be bored with him or any other person. He said his son was wild to learn something of this method of curing disease. The young man had been traveling from place to place, treating piles with some kind of ointment he had purchased. His education was very limited, and in fact he was ignorant of the human body. I told him he must get Gray's Anatomy, begin with the bones, and complete a knowledge of anatomy before he could be of any help to me. He said he thought it was a gift I had, and believed he had the same powers to heal. I told him it was a gift of hard study of all my life, and the result of brain work put in on standard authors of anatomy. But he was determined to study the art of healing, and I began to pound his head with osteopathy. It was not quite as hard as a bull's, for in about 12 months I got a few ideas in his untrained mind, after which he began to travel with me. He was a blank to begin with, but in the course of time I made him a fairly good operator. I am happy to state that he is still improving. My next pupil was a lightning rod peddler, whom I had cured of asthma. He too became wild to go with me and study. He was very ignorant, but so thankful for his cure of asthma that he was willing to learn the great science if I would take his promise to pay me $100 sometime. I took his promise, still have it, and fed himself, wife, father, and mother-in-law for several months or a year. He left me after a year or two and entered a medical school, and knows but little about either system. Like Paul, I tried all things, good and bad, till a few months passed by, when Dr. William Smith of Edinburgh, Scotland, came to my house to talk with me and learn something of the laws of cures, by which I had and was curing diseases on which medicine in all ages had failed. The conversation was as follows. I presume you are the famous Dr. Still I had heard much about over the state of Missouri. I am a graduate of medicine of 7 years in Edinburgh, Scotland. I am now selling surgical and scientific instruments for Allo & Co. of St. Louis. I have visited about 700 doctors in Missouri, and I hear of you in osteopathy everywhere I go, and since I landed in this town it is all the talk. I tried to learn something of it from the doctors here, but they could not tell me a word about it. I thought very strange of the doctors not knowing anything of a system of remedies that was being used in their own town for 5 or 6 years, with reports all over the state of its wonderful cures in fevers, flux, measles, mumps, fits, childbirth without pain, taking off, goitrous, pneumonia, sore eyes, asthma, and in fact, I have been told you can cure by this system any of the fevers or diseases of the climate. As I have supplied all the doctors of this town with surgical cutlery, they requested me to come to you and investigate your method. I thought it but honorable to tell you I was a doctor of medicine of 7 years' drill in Edinburgh, Scotland. The ones who sent me told me not to tell you that I was a doctor or that you would not talk to me. I had met Dr. Smith in my dooryard, close to a pole that had 2 vines running from it to other poles, was connecting wires switching off to my house and others in the neighborhood. I began to try to answer the doctor's questions of how and why I could cure diseases by this method. Looking at the pole that supported the two wires just spoken of, I said, as he was so frank as to tell me of the many years he had spent in the University of Edinburgh, and that he had seen the Queen of England at the ocean, and many things I had not, I felt that it too must be frank to tell him that I was but an ignorant man who had spent all my life in the West. I did not wish to take any advantage of him and tell him I was a philosopher and my father was a preacher, and I was going to run for Congress and lots more that my brothers and I would do, but determined to be just honest with him and tell him I was ignorant and trying to study what use those two wires were in electricity. He let out and told me he could tell me all about it, having had a practical knowledge of electricity. He explained if I would just take the trouble to follow those wires, I would find that the other ends in a separate jar or vats in which I would find two kinds of chemicals containing different elements, the positive and negative forces in electricity. As soon as the engine was fired up and put in motion, the opposing qualities came together with such great rapidity that endless explosion was the result as long as the engine kept up its action, concluding with, "Thus you have the electrical lights. You will find powerful fluids, acids, and all the ingredients necessary to generate electricity in the vats." At this point of his kind explanations, I asked him how many kinds of nerves were in man, to which question he kindly told me two, the motor and sensory. Where is man's power of action, and where is the power generated? He said the brain had two lobes and was the dynamo. Well, where is the engine? The heart is the most perfect of all engines known. What runs the heart, doctor? I suppose the spirit of life runs it. Is it voluntary in its action, doctor? It is involuntary and runs by life's forces. Perhaps some electricity helps to run the heart, don't it? Well, I must say, said the doctor, the actions and why of animal life are not fully understood yet. There is much to be learned about life's actions. Then I asked my new friend late from Scotland in St. Louis, and much later from a doctor's office where he had filled up with beer before he started to see the greatest humbug of all centuries, what effect a cake of soap would have on an electric battery if one should be put in the jars of fluids. The doctor snapped his black eyes and said, "I would play hell with it." "Well, doctor, I have another question I would like to ask you." He kindly said, "Certainly, I will answer any and all questions you may wish to ask if I can." As I had learned that a cake of soap would play the dickens with an electrical battery, I proceeded to ask him what effect 2 quarts of beer would have on the sensory and motor nerves of a man if you poured it in his stomach or electric jar. The doctor hesitated for a minute and said, "I would make a damned fool of him," and then added, "Darn your ignorance of electricity." I asked him what fever was. He said that depended on what kind of fever I wanted to know about. I asked him if there was more than one kind of fever, as I knew nothing of but one kind of heat. He went on and told me of typhoid, bilious, scarlet fever, and had a plenty of fever, and my ignorance had been so dense as not to let me see but one kind of heat in all nature, which was the result of electricity in motion, its intensity only marking the degrees of its actions. I gave it as my view that all kinds of nerves and had centers from which all necessary nerves branched off and supplied all forces for blood vessels, muscles, and other parts of the body, and plainly told him to get out of the old ruts of ignorance with nothing but pills and stupidity behind it. I asked him to think what effect we would get if we should cut the vasomotor nerves in 2. Could the blood vessels act to force blood through the body and keep life in motion, or should we cut a motor nerve of a limb? Could it move? If not, what would you expect if you ligate a limb so tightly as to cut off nerve supply? Would you expect that limb to be able to move? If not, would you not get a similar effect on the heart or lungs by interfering with the sensory ganglion at any point between the brain and heart? If so, why not suspend sensation and stop excitement of heart and slacken the velocity of blood that was simply obeying the mandates of electricity that had charge of the motor nerves, causing by its too great action of the heat which you call fever in all diseases? Do you not address all your remedies or drugs to the nerves that control the blood and other fluids of the body? I gave the doctor a few hows and whys by placing my finger on the nerves that govern the blood of the bowels and brain. At this time he said, "You have discovered that which all philosophers have thought and failed to find for 2,000 years, adding, I am no fool. As a doctor of medicine, I have read all history and know such that was never known before. Your town has a lot of medical doctors who are dumb as asses to be within 10 blocks of you for 5 years and not know the truth of the science you have unfolded here under their noses." As I now remember, the doctor's visit to me was in June or July, and after spending nearly all the afternoon in friendly discussion on the science, he asked to come back that evening. In the evening conversation, we talked of teaching a small school that winter in anatomy, as I wanted my sons to get a good knowledge of the science. I realized that the doctor was fully qualified to teach them, and as he wanted to study osteopathy, we soon struck up a trade, and in 2 months he opened a 4-month school in anatomy with a class of about 10 in a small house 16 by 22 feet, which I erected for that purpose. The class advanced as far as all of the bones and muscles of the arm and leg. A few of that class did not return to finish the study, others did, and are skilled reasoners, while those who failed to complete the study are failures. I have learned that if a student is allowed to go into the clinics and operating rooms before he masters anatomy, he gets cures mixed with an imperfect knowledge of the machine he tries to adjust. I know this to be true because I took the class after Dr. Smith had stopped with the study of the bones and of the body of the muscles of the arm and leg only. I could get a few ideas in their heads when I talked about a leg or arm, but could advance them no further. This imperfect knowledge created a desire to go into the world as cure-alls and know-alls who want to say and write all and much more than is in osteopathy. I had never taught, nor had I intention to teach the science, but I wanted my sons and daughter to study anatomy and receive a drill from a competent instructor, as I believed Dr. William Smith to be at that time. Since then, he has satisfied me that he is the best living anatomist on earth. His head and scalpel prove that he is as good as the best of any medical college of Europe or America. Since leaving Edinburgh, he has studied and dissected to the extent of the demands of osteopathy for 4 years, which makes at least 2 years further in its qualification for the purpose of remedies. Thus I feel safe in saying that Dr. Smith is today the wisest living anatomist on the globe, and will await the successful refutation of the refutation of the assertion. It took much cut and try to start without a dollar or friend who had any knowledge of the science I was trying to unfold, and mountains of prejudice to overcome, but I rather liked that, for the fun there was in it. I have often put my foot on the tail of my sleeping cat or pup, and pressed just hard enough to make them growl. They did the growling, and I got the fun, so the growling of my opponents had been food for the enjoyment. I have left the lady portion of my classes for the last of this narrative, as there was no sloths among them, and all could speak for themselves if necessary, as justice should never forget merit.